Obviously, because it's such a commitment, if somebody's interested in research, I would definitely seek out some resources. I think that would be, in my opinion, would be find someone you trust within the universities, either through extension or someone that has maybe done the research before. Especially that's critical. Probably somebody that has done the research that can give you some valuable input about what are the key things you want to make sure you can do or will do or be able to do, willing to do, and are your facilities capable of doing that or retrofitting to do that, and just understand all the costs and everything before we just say, oh, we're going to build it, let's just start doing it, and then chase our tail afterwards and try and figure out how to make it work. I think you'll save yourselves a lot of headaches doing that. Are probably the key ones.
Swine. Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Gene Gourley, who is president of the Gourley Research Group. Gene, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks, Laura.
Well, we're certainly glad to have you on today, Gene. Before we really kind of jump in at the topic of choice today, I'd like for you to maybe take a couple minutes and introduce yourself to the listeners.
Sure. Thanks, Laura. And so fifth generation farmer. Grew up here in Webster City, Iowa. So I'm basically 30 miles north of where Laura is recording right now from us, from Ames, Iowa. So have three brothers and a sister. My three brothers are active in the crop and livestock farm, and we have about 4,000 crop acres that we farm, and then we have about 5,000 sows that we raise farrow to finish. And so I grew up on that farm, and then was entering or finishing college actually at Iowa State. So it was in the mid 80s, and that was the farm crisis in Iowa. So my parents sat me down and said, you need to find off farm work for a while until we can afford to have you come back to the farm. So I was interviewing, and I had a class I was taking at Iowa State and for my undergrad, and had a question for a gentleman called Gene Gourley, which was president of Swine Graphics at the time, was just being created, and my family was working with Gene, and Gene had a nutrition company he was managing. And so he said, my question was on microscopy. Actually, Laura, was a class that was taught at Iowa State. So was looking at we had to formulate some diets. And so I was doing that and taking the farm diets that we had from our family farm, and something wasn't matching up, or we seemed to be really high in phosphorus, which we probably overfed phosphorus back in the day. This is all pre-phytase, which any of the listeners are going to say we had a lot of phosphorus in the diets. And so, yes, back then we did. But so I called him and said, yeah, something's wrong with the diets. And he said, well, I don't know about that, but he said, what are you doing when you're done with school? So that started my interviewing with him, and he hired me to come work at the time, Swine Graphics. And so I stayed there from basically 1986 through 2015, so almost 28 years I was with Swine Graphics. And in 89, I actually went back and did my master's degree there at Iowa State with in animal nutrition with Dr. Dean Zimmerman was my major professor. So Dean, I did my master's, and then continued to work as I was doing my master's with Swine Graphics, and then coordinated the nutrition and research for Swine Graphics for that 28 years. So and in 2015, it was actually 2014, I'd moved over on a consulting role with Swine Graphics and built my first research barn. I had conducted the research with Swine Graphics, obviously, for years, continued to manage that for them in the nutrition, and then built my first research barn, and saw a need for contract research with companies. Just through working at Swine Graphics, there was a desire for more research. And so my brothers were in need of, my family was in need of some spaces for pig flow for some of our sow farms. And so built my first wean to finish barn actually in 2012 and started some contract research. And then I've kind of grown from there and have about 6,500 spaces of research barns, and then of wean to finish facility spaces. And then I have 2,600 nursery spaces that I contract with my brothers as well. And my nephew-in-law owns the building, and I run the research in it. And then I've got another little barn that we do for some immune challenge, is what I'll put them as, challenge studies that we have. And I know I've worked with you, Laura, on some contract trials, and also worked with Dr. Nick Gobler on some trials, and Dr. John Patience, and just about everybody at Iowa State, I think, in one turn or another, have been through some trials with us. And also worked with K-State on a trial as well. And I think it was John's feed efficiency trial, actually, was a trial we worked together. So that's where I'm today, is, yep, running the research facilities, and still work with a family farm some, but they, prefer I stay away sometimes. So
Yeah, so I think that's actually a really nice introduction, Gene, to yourself and where you've been. And I had met you over the years while I was in grad school, and we were, I know, kind of going back and forth. Some of the colleagues were working on some data analysis with you and so forth. And then later we kind of reconnected as you were working on developing these research barns and facilities. And and I think it's really kind of interesting, especially as we think about some of our producers that might be listening to this, who have always had a desire to better understand the products that they are either feeding to the pigs or adding into the barns in some way, shape, or form, and have probably considered themselves of setting up research facilities or operations or trials. And so let's really start there, maybe from your perspectives. What's been the value of doing these research facilities for yourself or potentially for your family if you do projects internally?
I think some of the challenges, or some of the first steps, would be what are we trying to learn from the trials? What are they feeding trials? Are they just or genetics, vaccine, and maybe they've got all the above? They want to try and be able to do everything or capture everything. And I guess that's how I'll go about it, I guess, for that. And then part of it is the weighing of the animals, right? That seems to be the challenge of some of this, and the feeding, obviously. Sorry. So there's several steps there. So, and the weighing side of it, I think we've retrofitted some barns. Usually you have to come in and retrofit the gate. So if you're coming in and you know you got to replace the gating, maybe that's a good time that you say, okay, this is a facility that's still in good shape, but we want to turn this one into research. So if we're going to regate it, then that's the time to put in some wider hallways, possibly for running pigs to the scale, wherever you're going to put a pin scale in the barn. In mine, I've had the barns where we had pigs jump up on a scale. Never a fan of those. Pigs, little pigs, typically to feeder pig or a little bit after, don't care a whole lot to jump up on something. But when they get a little bigger, I know big animals can be a little more challenging to move to get to jump up on a scale. They don't necessarily like to when they get bigger. And so that becomes almost a welfare issue, actually, when you're trying to get pigs onto a scale and they don't want to go. And people can maybe design ramps that are better than me, but we always had them jumping up on a little lip and they just didn't like it much. But so all mine are in slat, basically, and that almost takes a new design, right? If you're building a facility, then you can incorporate that into the slats and have it actually floor level. I've got slats across mine where pigs don't even know they're running on the scale. It's just part of their pin surface, and area is no different. So that's one, is probably trying to think through how you're going to weigh the animals. If you're just doing a weight in, weight out, it's probably not as big a deal. But if you're going to do true trials where you're going to do some growth rate things, nutrition type studies, typically they're wanting some middle weights or time periods where you can kind of see in different periods of the animal's growth, and maybe it's certain areas that are using different things that you want to know. You probably need to take those intermediate weights. So that's one. And then the feed system, as you know, Laura, is the big challenge. Is how do you, if you're thinking about hand feeding them, I'd really shake my head and say, been there, done that, and you probably won't like it after you do it. But so the feed system's the next, and there's not a lot of options out there left anymore. I think FeedLogic might still be around. I know maybe some parts or some things they've been trying to do. I know some companies still using that equipment, so I know it's some folks are still using it. The Big Dutchman's probably been the biggest company that I know of that's been doing a lot of the research barns that I've heard of, and that's where they have a feed kitchen, so to speak, to capture the feed from the bulk bins, and then that weighs it into a hopper basically that's mixing it as well, or can mix it, and then delivers it via chain disc to each feeder, and then it has air system and a valve. So that's none of this, I would say, is inexpensive. So if anybody really wants to get into it, I'd say the buildings have been around, and I know prices have changed. I haven't priced one here recently, but let's just say we're going to spend $1 million on a 2,600 head facility. You're probably looking at least a good $500,000 in addition to maybe even more than that now to truly put in the scales, the extra gating, the extra feeders, the feed system and everything is going to be easily $500,000 to install that. So that's my sale to the various companies that want trials run, is this stuff's not free. And I think they realize that. So yeah, so that's kind of the things there.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And I think you hit the nail on the head, right? There's definitely expense, the gating, the feed system, even the extra bins outside if you're going to run different diets, if you're interested in feed additives and those types of things. And certainly you're absolutely right. We're going to be weighing pigs. We've got to have scales because most of us want to know at the end of the day what feed efficiency was, or how much faster did they get to market, kind of situation. And so those are all critical things you can't really give up when you're thinking about a research facility. What about labor?
And
We haven't really talked that
I was
quite
just
yet.
I was just going to say I was going to put it. So a couple of things we need to talk about is pig flow. Would be one. The labor obviously is the key one, and so I'd mentioned my the 6,600 spaces plus the 2,600 of nursery spaces. So I've got 2 full-time employees and then 1 part-time employee. So if people put the numbers to that, they'd say I'm way overstaffed for what you would need to do chores. But it's all the other detail of the data entry, the data collection, the weighing of the pigs, the daily chores, the individual injections of keeping track of that stuff, all very labor intense. And so if somebody thinks, "Oh, I'll build it and then we'll just have our normal management run it," as we know, that's doesn't work very well. So I definitely suggest that they reach out to hopefully one of the university extension or somebody that would have some past history with doing some of those things that could help them on the design, as well as talk to them about the labor portion of it, of what that's going to take. And maybe it's somebody that's within their shop, but I know there's a lot of grad students, I shouldn't say a lot, grad students are in high demand, as you know, Laura. And so, but those folks know how to run and conduct research because they've been there, done that. And so it's kind of a unique position on what you need to do there and knowing how to run those trials. Or you work with a university to help you, with they'll be interested in collaborating with you to run those trials and work out an agreement to have them. Yes, they may want to do some specific trials for the university, but potentially there's some win-wins where you can do some product or genetics or amino acids or whatever nutrition studies they might be. And so that'd be another route if somebody's considering it, to maybe look that way. So
Mhm. Yeah, and I think you kind of alluded to that too. Some of the people that you have on staff are skilled. You have some individuals that have an advanced degree for that reason, right, to help set trials up. And I think that is something, particularly for our small farmers. They may not have the ability to invest in all the staffing, and so they need to find those people that they consult with. Because at the end of the day, we still have to analyze that data. It's great to capture it, but how do we analyze it? And probably people aren't quite skilled to really put the pen to the paper and really look at it from a repeatability standpoint, right? If I'm going to invest $1 in this feed additive, what's my return on investment going to be consistently? And so, how did you kind of manage some of that? Or even still today, how do you manage some of that?
yeah. So, I mean, on the statistics side and analysis side, you're exactly right. I mean, I actually job all that out now. So I utilize grad students essentially at Iowa State have been helping me with statistics, because honestly, statistics, I don't want to say necessarily changed per se, but it has from the standpoint of the technologies and the capabilities of how you have to analyze data now. And so it's just one thing that I have not kept up with on the statistics, and it's kind of an area where it's just easier to hire it or pay someone to do that. Now, when I provide the data to them, that to me is the point you're talking about with that staff, making sure the data. So I provide everything to the grad student that is in an Excel format by pen, cleaned up and ready to go, so to speak. And maybe you'd have somebody help you do that at the university, but most times it takes boots on the ground that understand where'd that pig go. We're missing a pig here. We need to look up, we wrote it on this weight sheet instead of on the off test sheet. And so there's just simple things that can drive you nuts sometimes from a data entry standpoint, but it's really that cleanup. And that's where the person that just has been there with the university and understood and done trials that kind of know some of that process. And that's the things that I think could be a challenge for somebody if they don't have that quality staff to help them out.
And I think one of the other things I'm hearing you say too, at least if I were a producer, that I'm still probably kind of in that sticker shock mode of a $1.5 million facility. And you go, boy, I should really get some great ROIs. And I think it's important to remind people that not every trial you do through a facility is going to be a positive result. In fact, a lot of the studies I do, it might be a non-result. And so how do you help justify that value? Because there is value, right? So how do you justify that?
And so, I mean, excellent point, Laura. And that's exactly what Dr. Al Lehman, when we went about it, was he said, I bet, or I feel we will learn as much or more about the things we shouldn't do versus the things we think we should do, or the products we think we should use. And that's not a hit on the companies out there. There's a lot of good products and things that we're using from companies. And it's just finding the right ones that work within your operation, within your pig flow, your genetics, your health. I mean, facilities, there's just so many things that impact how products work and how they succeed on farms. And so, that was kind of the ROI that we came back with, was that we know not everything is going to work. And so, but part of it was, if we decide to ignore that stuff and just put the product in, that was hitting the bottom line as well, right? And it may not be working. Now you're spending money on something, it could be $1 a pig or $1.50 or even, Lord forbid, more than that. But, when you start looking at genetic stuff, you've got, selecting the wrong board line could be extremely expensive long term. So I think those things we felt, knowing what not to do, created more revenue for us, so to speak, than the things that we found that we do need to be adding in. So, so that's, yeah. If you go into the CEO and say, "Yep, we're going to justify this by what we can use for products," I think that's wrong. It's trying to figure out how we need to adjust programs, feeding programs, whether it be then genetics, whether it be nutritional products, vaccines, all those things. I think would be hit the bottom line on knowing whether or not we should be using them. So,
very good. Yeah, and then I guess kind of my other question here is you've talked a bit about some of the items that we should be considering, but if you really think back on some of your experiences, what would be some common pitfalls or things that you would tell people to make sure that they're absolutely avoiding when they handle research?
yeah, it's a good point. There's one that's come up, and I've asked several people, and it's one that I think escapes us sometimes. And so at Swine Graphics, back when we were conducting research, we had our sow farms that would hold pigs at the farm for a few days, and then would have some fresh weaned pigs that would come with those two. And our goal was, from a biosecurity, we were trying to go to the farm once a week. And so that was our goal. And so to do that, it made it a little bit of a challenge for research. It was nice because I got the 1,300 pigs or whatever I needed to set up the trial. But I found quickly, if I didn't have them load on the truck the held pigs versus the fresh and keep them separated, we noticed a total difference in the way those pigs started on feed. And so I asked people, if you're going to buy pigs to put in a research facility. I would, especially weaners, I'm not sure it's a big deal with feeder pigs at that point, but for wean pigs, definitely would be to understand your sow source. And even if it's your own sow source, sometimes the finishing side isn't always talking to the sow side. Sow side doesn't really know, okay, what's going on. I'm sending them 1,300 pigs. They're getting what I've got either in the holding room or fresh off the sows, not worried about keeping them separate. Whereas the thing we learned at Swine Graphics was I needed those identified and kept separate. And now the question is, in the trials, would we run those separate of each other? Depending on the trial we were looking at, but 90% of the time, I'd say I blended them equally within pens, whatever that ratio was that the farm sent to me, because I noticed those that had been held had kind of been through the stress of weaning and knew where to go to get water, where to go get feed. And even, a couple days on the South farm was amazing how those pigs had transitioned so much better than the fresh pigs that are coming in saying, what the heck just happened to me? Where's mom? I'm hungry, but I'm tired. I'm gonna go lay down. And you got others that are kind of showing them the way to the feeder, to the water. And I think that actually is quite interesting work or research that for someone doing it, if they're going to do wean to finish or even nursery research, need to be aware of what's being sent to them from their own farm or from a contract or a farm that they're buying pigs from. So hopefully they can find that information from the farm and they're willing to work with them on what they send them. So other than that, yeah, probably wean age on some of it can be important depending on the sow farm and the size. If that varied and all of a sudden you're getting one group is coming to you, even if they're fresh weaned and you got a wider age spread in there, knowing kind of we would go down if they were further than 2 days spread on an age, we'd try and keep those separate. So that I could end up again commingling those in the same pens, or depending on the trial, if we wanted to look at age, we'd try and separate them out. But that, as you know, becomes even more challenges of replication and doing those studies. But that can be a challenge too, is just understanding wean age. And then, yeah, probably the biggest ones on nursery studies. Health status is probably the other one, just kind of what's going on, what are we going to see when the pigs get there, especially when you're doing early starter diet type things. Are these pigs coming in with a health challenge and all of a sudden they don't even want to get up and eat? So now are we really finding out the information we want from that diet when we don't, we're having struggles getting them started on feed, period. So knowing that, and sometimes that might be what vaccinations are being given, and what, how hard that's potentially hitting them coming in the door. And then yeah, are they have any other kind of issues, health challenges going on in the farrowing house at the time you get pigs? So those are yeah, there's probably some others that I'll have to think about. You live those things and you forget some of that stuff, or it just becomes second nature. But so.
Absolutely. Well, I think you hit the big one on the head, though. Health challenge, right? Anytime we do a research project, we have in our mind that it's going to be perfect and the pigs are going to always stay healthy, and that's not real world, right? We're dealing with a biological animal. The farm could break with flu the day before we get the pigs. We could get PRRS in the middle of a trial. And I think it's important to remind producers that even in those, as you've mentioned, even in those moments, there are learning opportunities. And it's real world, right? It's what we're going to see in our barns at some point again. And it's important to just remember that and still take that data and use it in a way that might provide some other value.
Yep.
So,
and if you get, if we had, if it was coming from our own source flow, we were trying to understand what that sow farm, we would start checking with the production staff that had been getting pigs from that flow for a period of time, saying, what are you running into? How are the pigs starting? Are you on a normal basis out in production, to kind of know what was coming at us, to give us a little heads up of we might have to work a little harder with this group or pay a little more attention. As I was purchasing genetics or purchasing pigs, the genetics mattered. It was interesting how certain genetics would start on feed differently than other genetics, and some we need to go up and get up quite often just to get them up and get them to try and investigate, just start a little harder than others. And so I think it's important, if it's their own production or they're getting the same production over and over again, they'll know kind of what that is. But if like I did on a few fills and turns or research barns, I had a different source, and so definitely needed to be aware of what was going on with different source genetics. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Gene, I really enjoyed our conversation, but I see our time's really about up. So before we jump over to those infamous three questions, are there any key points that you'd like to just summarize for our audience today around doing research in your own facilities?
yeah. Um, Probably, obviously, because it's such a commitment. If somebody's interested in research, I would definitely seek out some resources. I think that would be, in my opinion, would be find someone you trust within the universities, either through extension or someone that has maybe done the research before. Especially that's critical. Probably somebody that has done the research that can give you some valuable input about what are the key things you want to make sure you can do or will do or be able to do, willing to do, and are your facilities capable of doing that or retrofitting to do that, and just understand all the costs and everything before we just say, oh, we're going to build it, let's just start doing it, and then chase our tail afterwards and try and figure out how to make it work. I think you'll save yourselves a lot of headaches doing that. Are probably the key ones. And then if you do get into research, then it's the same thing. Talk to the universities about what things you need to be watching out for. How do I do data collection? What are the details of labor, of things that I need to make sure I collect and get collected well? Because just setting it up and saying I've got research and then hoping you have good results come out of it, I'd probably say Laura and I could both tell you probably horror stories of some things you hear people doing by just one barn versus the other, or just a trial that was run incorrectly or improperly that actually could cost them a lot of money, unfortunately. And so I think you really need to seek out input and good advice. And I think there's a lot of them I know at Iowa State there and Ames and other universities as well, but that can give good advice. So that'd be probably the biggest thing.
Very good.
It's time for our famous three.
So as we wrap up, we like to ask our guest speaker a couple of questions. The first question we ask is, do you have a swine resource that you would recommend?
Um, my swine resource, probably kick me for saying it, but I'd ask Wayne Cast. If I ever have questions on things, I call Wayne. Might cost me something, I don't know what, but not very often. Usually just but Wayne Cast, and then probably on the other side from is Dr. Mark Fitzsimmons is probably my go-to from production medicine questions, flow, facility designs, a lot of different things Mark has expertise in and over the years. And I worked with him for 30 years and still work with him today, I should say, my whole career. So those are my two swine resources. And I'm going to put in my plug for Iowa State, Laura, and I apologize. You guys are too easy. You're in my backyard, so I use you guys all the time. So I would say Iowa State for sure. I got Laura, I got Nick, I had John, I got Jason Ross, Lance Baumgart. I mean, you got all kinds of great resources there at Iowa State. And so it's in my backyard, and I don't give you guys enough credit. I apologize. So great team there at Iowa State too.
Yeah, they are a great team. I will give you that. Well, the other question I like to ask is really around anything that you're reading that's not pig related that you might recommend to the listeners.
There's most people, if they went to Iowa Swine Day, was probably may have seen Peter Zion, if I say his name correctly, Zion, on the world is just the beginning. The end of the world is just the beginning. Sorry, mapping the collapse of globalization. I heard him speak, and he's a very dynamic speaker. But in reading his book here, I think that's worth catching some things. And I know at Swine Day, I think we were talking about, Laura, that he predicted some things that if they happen would be big items, and a couple of them have occurred in the world stage of stuff. And so I think that's a interesting read. I'm not all the way through it, and so that's kind of what I'm looking at or reading lately. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've heard that the book is about, he's equally dynamic in his book as he is in person. And so that obviously makes it a pleasure to read,
Good
right? So
read.
you
Yep.
can yeah, listen to them and hear them in your own head. That's always a bonus. Well, the last question really kind of focuses a little bit more personal, and it's around if there's somebody in your mind's eye that you have defined as successful, what's a trait about them that you think's allowed them to be successful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe you pick a mentor or somebody, I guess, that would be the person that I had, and so or that resource was, and I would say it was Dr. Al Lehman was probably um, my go-to person and was my boss at Swine Graphics for several years until unfortunately he passed away in France jogging at the young age of 48 years old, way too young. But Al always had a knack or a knack. He just people would come to him. I mean, he had a presence about him, and I tried to understand what was that Al had, and I think it was he was a people person, and so anytime I was with him, he would have somebody, a farmer or a producer, come up and talk to him, and Al had been on his farm, or the gentleman had seen him at a conference and talked to him, and Al would remember their name. He knew their name. He knew their wife's name. He knew their kids. He knew what their ages were. Al said, "Oh, how's your son doing?" And I know he's playing football. I think he sprained his ankle or broke his leg or something. Is he doing good? And just that personality, you just see people light up. And so it is a people industry, a people business. And Al had a way to bring the best out of the people and would just show that he cared. And so I think all of us could use more of that in today's world, I think. But Al had a way to do it. And as folks listening might know, the Al Lehman Conference in Minnesota is named after Dr. Al Lehman, my former boss, and just a great individual, and was my mentor. And so humble, very humble, and but also very people person. And so that'd be my take home, or my mentor for everybody would be to keep it a people industry, and that's what we do, and it's a great industry. That's why I love being in it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a great example of a wonderful mentor. He certainly has done a lot for the swine industry and certainly for the veterinary profession as well. So, Gene, as I mentioned, our time is up. So I do want to thank you again for your time today. I've greatly appreciated the conversation. You provided some great information for our producers, especially those who certainly have considered doing research in their facilities and want to better understand how to do that. Again, for our listeners, this is Gene Gourley with Gourley Research Group. So, Gene, again, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Laura. Appreciate it.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.